digging around it, brushing away the mud, pulled it out, and there was this giant stone head gazing back at him.
Scientists have been listening to the story being told by a man who was born 1,000 years ago.
A 14,000-year-old mystery was recently pulled from the dark silt of a Florida sinkhole. This discovery involves an ancient skeleton and a DNA profile that finally tells the real story of how humans reached this land. Everything we once believed about the first pioneers is now being questioned because of the evidence found in these murky waters. And his revelation changes everything we thought we knew about our history. The Aucilla River discovery. The Aucilla River in northern Florida looks like dark ink. This liquid is stained so deeply by tannins from rotting leaves that it blocks out almost all sunlight, making the world pitch black just a few feet below the surface. Divers who enter this river have to deal with zero visibility, often working entirely by touch while avoiding tangled trees and the occasional alligator. Between 2012 and 2014, a team led by Jesse Halligan and Michael Waters began a massive project to explore a limestone sinkhole at the bottom of this river known as the Page-Ladson site. They spent 3 years underwater, carefully vacuuming away layers of silt and mud nearly 30 feet below the surface. They were looking for a very specific layer of earth that had been sealed off from the rest of the world for thousands of years. During their search, the team found something incredible buried deep in the riverbed. They pulled up a stone knife, known as a biface, which had been chipped from a local rock called chert to create a sharp edge. Right next to it, they found several pieces of a mastodon tusk. These items were found together in the exact same spot, which is a rare event in the world of archaeology.
Some archaeologists recently claimed to have found the first evidence of humans in the southern United States from more than 14,000 years ago in North Florida.
Usually, the ground in Florida is very acidic, and it eats away at things like bone and ivory until nothing is left but dust. However, the Page-Ladson sinkhole is different because it has no oxygen at the bottom. This lack of air stopped the bacteria that cause rot, turning the sinkhole into a natural vault that protected these delicate objects. Because of this strange environment, the river held on to a secret that would force every scientist to rethink the story of the very first people to call America home. Finding these items was just the first step in realizing that the timeline of human history was about to be completely rewritten by the things hidden in that mud. The mastodon in the room. The mastodon tusk found at the bottom of the river was much more than just a piece of an old animal. When experts took it back to the lab and put it under a microscope, they found something that changed the entire history of the continent. There were 6 deep, parallel grooves at the base of the tusk, where it would have joined the skull. These marks were made by someone using a stone tool to cut the tusk away from the giant creature. This was clear proof of butchery, showing that humans were actively taking apart these 6-ton beasts for their ivory or meat. To make sure they knew exactly when this event happened, the researchers did not just test the tusk itself, but used radiocarbon dating on 70 different samples of plant bits, like seeds and twigs, that were trapped in the mud right next to the tusk. The results from the lab gave them a solid date of 14,550 years ago.
In a place that would have been inside the mastodon skull when the mastodon was alive, right? And so they're like, this was evidence that people were butchering this mastodon.
This number was a total shock because it is 1,500 years older than the Clovis people, who were always thought to be the very first humans in the Americas. This discovery proved that the history books were wrong about the timing of the first arrival. If people were already living and hunting in Florida over 14,000 years ago, it means they did not just show up. They would have needed thousands of years to travel all the way from the northern land bridge down to the southern tip of the continent. This means the real story of the first Americans started much earlier than anyone ever guessed. It also suggests that these people were not just wandering lost in the woods, but were master hunters who could take down the largest animals on Earth. The ghost of Hoyo Negro. While the discoveries in Florida proved that humans were in the south much earlier than expected, a different underwater cave in Mexico provided the missing link to explain who these people actually were. This site is called Hoyo Negro, which means black hole, and it is a massive bell-shaped chamber deep inside a submerged cave system. In 2007, divers found the nearly complete skeleton of a teenage girl they named Naya. Much like the finds in the Aucilla River, Naya was perfectly preserved because she was tucked away in a quiet, oxygen-poor environment for over 13,000 years. She was a young traveler who had fallen into this deep pit before the caves were even flooded by rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. Naya created a huge puzzle for scientists because of how she looked. When researchers studied her skull, they noticed it had a narrow shape and a small forehead, which looked more like ancient people from Siberia or even Africa than modern Native Americans. For a long time, this led many experts to believe that the first people in the Americas were a totally different group that died out and was replaced by a second wave of migrants later on. This idea is known as the morphology debate, where scientists try to guess a person's heritage based on the shape of their bones. If Naya looked so different from the people living in the Americas today, how could she be their ancestor? The answer to this mystery was hidden deep inside her bones. To solve the riddle, scientists used a high-tech method to extract her DNA. They focused on her teeth and a part of the skull called the petrous bone. This bone is located near the inner ear and is the hardest, densest bone in the human body. Because it is so thick, it acts like a protective shell for DNA, keeping it safe from the water and bacteria that usually destroy genetic material over thousands of years. Even in a submerged cave, the petrous bone can hold onto tiny fragments of a person's genetic code, like a tiny hard drive from the past.
Naya's skull, and Naya has a complete skull. And from that complete skull, we are going to reconstruct her face.
When the results from Naya's DNA came back, they were a total game changer. Despite the fact that her skull looked different, her genetic signature was a perfect match for modern Native Americans. Specifically, she carried a genetic marker that traced back to a population that lived in Beringia, the land bridge between Asia and Alaska during the peak of the Ice Age. This proved once and for all that there was not a lost group of people who vanished. Instead, it showed that the physical appearance of people changed over thousands of years as they adapted to the new environment, but their bloodline remained the same. This genetic connection tied the girl in Mexico to the hunters in Florida, proving they were all part of one massive early family tree that had been exploring the continent for much longer than the experts ever dreamed. Breaking the Clovis barrier. For nearly 80 years, a single idea ruled over the study of American history. This idea was called the Clovis first theory. It started in the 1930s when researchers found beautiful, leaf-shaped stone spear points near Clovis, New Mexico. These tools were found alongside the bones of mammoths, and they were dated to about 13,000 years ago. Because these spear points were found all over North America, scientists decided this must be the evidence of the very first people to step foot on the continent. The story they told was simple. A group of hunters walked across the land bridge from Siberia, waited for a gap to open in the massive ice sheets covering Canada, and then rushed south to fill up the empty land. This story became a dogma, which is a set of rules that almost no one was allowed to question. If an archaeologist claimed to find something older than Clovis, they were often mocked or ignored by the old guard of the scientific community. This rigid way of thinking created a huge barrier for new discoveries. For decades, any site that seemed too old was dismissed as a mistake. Experts would say the dating was wrong, or that the tools were just natural rocks carved by the river. But as technology improved, the evidence against Clovis first became too loud to ignore. The first major crack in the wall happened at a place called Monteverde in Chile, which is at the very bottom of South America. Archaeologists there found a settlement that was 14,500 years old. This was a huge problem for the old guard. If the first people only entered through Alaska 13,000 years ago, how could they have reached the southern tip of Chile 1,500 years before they even arrived? The Page-Ladson site in Florida was the final blow that shattered the Clovis barrier for good. By finding butchered mastodon bones and stone tools in Florida that were also 14,550 years old, researchers proved that Monteverde was not just a one-time fluke. Having sites that old on opposite ends of the world, one in the deep south of the United States and one in South America, showed a clear pattern. It proved that humans were already settled across the entire hemisphere, while the massive ice sheets in the north were still completely closed. There was no way these people could have walked through the center of the continent because there was a wall of ice miles high in their way. This change in thinking changed everything we thought we knew about the first Americans. It meant that the first people weren't the Clovis hunters at all, but an even older group of explorers who had already mastered the land long before. The discovery in the Florida riverbed forced the old guard to admit that their 80-year-old story was missing its most important chapters. With the Clovis barrier broken, scientists had to look for a different way these people could have moved so far and so fast. If the path through the ice was blocked, these ancient travelers must have found a secret highway that didn't involve walking at all. The genomic time machine. To understand how people reached Florida so early, we have to look at the tiny bits of code hidden inside their cells. This code is called mitochondrial DNA, and it is like a family diary that is passed down only from mothers to their children. When scientists looked at the DNA from ancient remains like Naya and other early skeletons, they found a very specific marker called haplogroup D1. This marker is like a unique badge that almost all early Americans carried. What makes this badge so special is that it supposedly does not exist in Asia today. This means that the people who carry it are part of a brand new family tree that was born right here in the Americas. This genetic badge tells us a story about a long period of waiting known as the Beringian standstill. According to this theory, the ancestors of the first Americans did not just rush across the land bridge from Siberia to Alaska. Instead, they got stuck there for about 10,000 years. During the peak of the Ice Age, the world was so cold that massive ice sheets blocked the way into the rest of North America. But the land bridge itself was a safe, grassy area where people could live. While they were trapped in this frozen waiting room, they became genetically different from their cousins back in Asia. This is when haplogroup D1 and other unique markers first appeared. They were becoming a new people, isolated from the rest of the world and waiting for the ice to melt so they could finally move south. A major study published in 2018 in the journal Science provided the proof for what happened next. Researchers analyzed 49 ancient genomes from people who lived all across North and South America over a span of 10,000 years. This study revealed that as soon as a path opened up, these people did not just slowly wander. They exploded across the landscape, and the data showed a massive and rapid expansion where one group of people moved from the north all the way down to the tip of South America in just a few centuries. It was a sprint, not a crawl, which explains why we find people in Florida and Chile at almost the exact same time in history. The DNA proves that these pioneers were all part of the same founding family. They shared the same bloodline and the same history, even if they ended up thousands of miles apart. This genetic map shows that the people at the Page-Ladson site in Florida were not a random group that got lost, but a part of a highly organized and successful expansion of humans who were claiming an entire hemisphere for the first time. But if the way through the middle of the continent was still blocked by walls of ice, these people must have used a completely different way to travel so far and so fast. The Kelp Highway. If the way through the middle of the continent was blocked by miles of solid ice, scientists had to figure out how people reached Florida so early. For a long time, the only path anyone talked about was the inland route. But we now know that path was a frozen wasteland with no food or shelter until much later. This realization led to a new and exciting idea called the Kelp Highway. Instead of walking through the freezing center of the land, these early explorers likely stayed close to the ocean. They followed the Pacific coast, moving south from Alaska and Canada in boats. This coastal path was much friendlier than the inland ice because the ocean was full of life, even during the peak of the cold years. The theory suggests that these people were master mariners who knew how to build and handle small boats. They followed a line of giant seaweed forests, known as kelp, that grew all along the shore from Asia down to the tip of South America. These underwater forests were like an endless grocery store for the travelers. They were packed with fish, shellfish, seals, and sea otters, which meant the explorers never had to worry about running out of food as they moved. Because they were traveling by water, they did not have to deal with mountains, thick forests, or deep snow. This maritime revolution changed the way we think about the first Americans. Now, we can surmise that not only were they hunters, they were also skilled sailors who understood the currents and the tides. Moving by boat is much faster than walking, which explains the mystery of why we find humans in Florida and Chile at almost the exact same time. A group of people in boats can cover dozens of miles in a single day, while a group on foot with children and gear might only move a few miles. This speed allowed them to hop from one island to the next and settle in new bays and river mouths very quickly. As they reached the area around Mexico, some groups likely headed east, crossing over the land at narrow points to reach the Gulf of Mexico. This would lead them straight to the coast of Florida.
Clearwater Beach out here on the Gulf of Mexico. This side is western Florida beaches,
where the warm waters and rich rivers were waiting for them. By following the coast, these people were able to bypass the giant walls of ice that stopped everyone else. They arrived in Florida as experts in finding food from the water, but they also brought with them the tools and knowledge to hunt the giant animals on land. This connection between the ocean and the land is why we find such a mix of skills at sites like Page Ladson. These pioneers had the best of both worlds, and they used their maritime speed to claim the entire continent in record time. Their journey didn't just stop at the shore, though. Once they settled into the Florida savannah, they began creating a new type of technology that was unlike anything else in the world. Pre-Clovis technology. The stone tools found at the Page Ladson site tell a story of incredible skill and planning. The most famous find is a small stone knife called a biface. It was made by chipping away at a piece of local rock until it had a sharp edge on both sides. This was a thin, light, and very sharp blade that would have been perfect for cutting through thick animal hide. But this wasn't the only place where these ancient tools were turning up. At a site called Friedkin in Texas and another called Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, archaeologists have found thousands of similar stone tools buried in layers far below the Clovis level. These tools include small spear points and scrapers that were clearly part of a well-developed toolkit. These artifacts prove that the craftsmanship of these early people was top tier. For a long time, people assumed that any technology older than Clovis must have been primitive or poorly made. But the evidence shows the exact opposite. These pre-Clovis hunters were making tools that were specifically designed for the harsh and varied environments of the Ice Age. They knew exactly which types of stone would hold the sharpest edge and how to shape them so they wouldn't snap during a hunt. Their work was sophisticated and followed a very specific style that stayed consistent across different camps. This shows that they had a shared culture and taught these skills from one generation to the next. One of the most mind-blowing parts of the Page Ladson discovery wasn't just the stone, but the wood. In almost every other part of the world, wooden tools from 14,000 years ago have rotted away into nothing. But because the Florida sinkhole had no oxygen, it acted like a time machine for organic materials. The team found a wooden stake that had been carved and sharpened by human hands. This is an incredibly rare find because it gives us a look at the invisible part of ancient technology. Most of what these people used was likely made of wood, bone, and fiber, but those things rarely survive. Finding a carved wooden tool proves that these people were master woodworkers. likely making everything from spear shafts to tent pegs and maybe even parts for boats. The level of detail in these tools shows that the people living in Florida 14,550 years ago were not struggling to survive. They were thriving, and they had mastered their surroundings and created a high-tech world using the natural materials around them. This advanced technology allowed them to live alongside some of the most terrifying creatures to ever walk the earth. To understand just how impressive these hunters were, we have to look at the world they lived in. Florida's lost savannah. If you could travel back 14,500 years, you would not recognize Florida. Today, the state is a lush, humid peninsula surrounded by warm water. But during the Ice Age, it was a vast, dry frontier. Because so much of the Earth's water was locked up in massive glaciers to the north, sea levels were about 300 feet lower than they are today. This meant that Florida was actually double its current size. The coastline stretched miles out into what is now the Gulf of Mexico, creating a huge, flat plain that looked more like the African savannah than a tropical swamp. Instead of thick palm trees and mangroves, the land was covered in hardy grasses, scrub oaks, and wide-open prairies that stretched as far as the eye could see. This massive landscape was the home of the giants. Scientists call these animals megafauna, and they were truly spectacular. The most famous were the mastodons, the heavy, fur-covered cousins of the elephant that the people at Page-Ladson hunted. But they weren't alone. Giant ground sloths, some as big as a modern-day van, wandered the plains and used their massive claws to pull down tree branches. There were also glyptodons, which were essentially armadillos the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, covered in thick, bony armor. These peaceful plant eaters were constantly on the lookout for the predators of the era. The most terrifying was the saber-toothed cat, a powerful hunter with 8-inch fangs designed to take down large prey. Living in this world meant the early Florida pioneers had to be smart, fast, and always aware of their surroundings. The biggest challenge for both humans and animals in this dry Florida was finding water. Because the climate was so much cooler and drier, there were very few flowing rivers or lakes. Most of the water was trapped deep underground in the limestone bedrock. This made sinkholes, or cenotes, the most important places on the map. These deep pits were the only spots where the groundwater reached the surface, creating natural wells that stayed filled even during long droughts. For the early people, these sinkholes were the center of life. Every animal for miles, from the smallest deer to the largest mastodon, had to visit these watering holes to survive. By staying near these sinkholes, the early hunters in Florida were making a very tactical choice. They knew that if they waited long enough, their dinner would eventually have to come to them.
Central Florida suddenly looks like the cratered lunar landscape. Sinkholes are opening up and forcing families from their homes.
This is likely why we find so many bones and tools at the bottom of the Page-Ladson site. The struggle for survival in this dry, wild land created a bond between the people and the animals they hunted. But as the world began to warm and the ice started to melt, the question became whether these people were newcomers or if they had been part of this land for much longer than their DNA first suggested. The Great Migration Debate. For a long time, the biggest fight in archaeology was about how many times people actually moved from Asia into the Americas. Some experts looked at the different skull shapes of ancient skeletons and argued that there must have been many different waves of people, perhaps even from different parts of the world. They thought one group might have arrived and stayed for a while, only to be replaced by a second or third group later on. However, the modern study of ancient DNA has finally stepped in to settle this debate with hard data. By looking at the genetic code of hundreds of ancient remains, scientists can now track the actual movement of these populations through time like a giant family tree. The data reveals that almost all Native Americans today, as well as the ancient people like the girl found in the Mexican cave, come from one primary group of founders. This group is often split into two main branches that scientists call Ancestral A and Ancestral B. These two lineages were like two main trunks growing from the same set of roots. The split between these groups happened roughly 15 to 20,000 years ago, likely just as people were starting to move south from the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. One group stayed along the coast, while the other moved toward the interior, but they both shared the same original DNA signature. This discovery brought major clarity for scientists by explaining why people across the Americas share similar DNA despite differences in skeletal features. Even though individuals like Naya had narrower faces, unlike many today, her DNA showed she belonged to the same founding population. These physical differences were not due to separate origins, but to natural changes over time. As humans adapt to new climates, diets, and environments, their appearance evolves. It is a clear example of evolution happening faster than many people expect. The scientific consensus today is that there was one major pulse of people who claimed the entire continent. These pioneers arrived with a shared culture and a shared genetic map. They were a single, highly successful population that broke apart into different tribes and groups as they spread out to fill every corner of the Americas, from the dry plains of Florida to the high mountains of Chile. This means that the hunters at the Page-Ladson site were not just a random group of lost wanderers. They were part of a massive, coordinated expansion that left a permanent mark on the world. Their story is not just found in the dirt or the stones, but in the living cells of millions of people who still call this land home today. The legacy in the bloodline. The most incredible part of this story is that it never truly ended. While the mastodons are gone and the ice has melted, the DNA of the people from the Page-Ladson site and Hoyo Negro is still here. When scientists compare the genetic sequences of these 14,000-year-old individuals to contemporary indigenous populations, the connection is undeniable. These ancient pioneers are the direct ancestors of the tribal nations living across the Americas today. This means that the history of these people does not begin with the arrival of Europeans or even with the Clovis hunters. It goes back nearly 15,000 years to the very first explorers who stepped off their boats and began a life in the Florida savannah. This discovery reshapes the story of the Americas. For years, the land was portrayed as empty or inhabited only by simple nomads. Now, evidence shows these early peoples were skilled, complex, and connected to modern populations. Science is aligning with long-held indigenous oral histories, giving long-ignored narratives physical proof. These findings reveal deep roots embedded in the land itself, stretching back thousands of years and showing that these communities have always belonged to this continent. The future of this research is still hidden beneath the dark water of the Aucilla River. Believe it or not, archaeologists have only explored about 10% of the riverbed. That means 90% of this underwater time capsule is still waiting to be discovered. Every time a diver goes down, there is a chance they will find another tooth, another stone tool, or perhaps an even older skeleton that could push the timeline back even further. We are only just beginning to understand the true depth of human history in Florida. The murky waters of the sinkholes are holding on to secrets that could rewrite the books all over again.
At least a dozen sinkholes have opened up in the Central Florida subdivision over the past week.
So now we have to ask, if a single skeleton in the mud could rewrite the entire history of a continent, what other secrets are still waiting for us at the bottom of Florida's darkest rivers? Could there be an even older lineage hidden in the deep that proves we have been here much longer than 14,000 years? Leave your answers in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoy this video, please click on the next one on your screen.